My name is Maximum Decimus Meridius, Commander of the Armies of the North, General of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true Emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. Who can name that film? I think a lot of people will know where that is from. And what a cracking story that is. It's the story of a general in the Roman Empire forced into captivity and made to perform as a gladiator. Well, today I would like to tell you another story from the Roman Empire. And this is also a story about a man who was a captive. So make sure you're sitting comfortably. So this guy's name, not quite as cool as Maximus Decimus Meridius. This guy was called Barry. Well, that's just what I like to call him. And unlike Maximum, Barry was a Jew. He didn't like the Roman Empire. He didn't like the way they did things, and he didn't want to live under Roman rule. Barry was actually a member of the Zealots, which was a group of Jews, so still very much Jewish, but they were aggressively against Roman paganism. They were extremists, and they would go into public places with hidden daggers and weapons, and they would kill any person that was friendly to Rome. And so Barry stirred up the masses and he caused a lot of trouble, and he rebelled against all Roman activity. He absolutely despised the Roman governor in his area, who tried to stop any religious activity that didn't fit with the Roman culture. And Barry watched with anger as he witnessed Jewish high priests, Pharisees, and people like that who became nothing more than pro-Roman collaborators. They were just puppets of the state, doing the Roman dirty work. So Barry was fueled by anger at the injustice, but he channeled that injustice into violence and hatred. And eventually he was arrested for killing a man with his bare hands. There was a trial, he was found guilty, and his punishment was death. He was put into prison until his time to die came. Now, Roman prisons were very different to the prisons that we have today. So the prisoners would have had chains around their legs, their wrists would have been shackled. They also had a chain around their neck, and then that chain was linked to a wall so they couldn't move. Sometimes they were placed in wooden stocks, so their legs and their arms would be stretched out as far as they could go to stop any kind of movement at all. And what this meant, if you're in that position, is their neck would then be bent forward into kind of this position, and they would be locked into place. Incredibly uncomfortable and painful. And that is how they'd remain for days, for weeks, for months at a time, until every fibre of their body would cry out in pain. Their best company was cockroaches and rats. There were no visitors, there were no windows, there was no hope. And if Barry listened really hard, sometimes he could catch the chatter of people as they walked outside the prison wall. Now, one day after many months in prison, Barry heard a large crowd outside where he was. He could hear that the governor shouting something. He couldn't make out what it was, and he could hear the crowd cheering and shouting back. He strained his ears to listen, and he heard his own name being said by the governor. "Barry, Barry, Barry," the crowd shouted back. The governor spoke again, but Barry couldn't quite hear the question. "Kill him! Kill him!" the crowd yelled. There seemed to be hundreds of them, maybe even thousands of people. Why were they demanding Barry's death today, he wondered. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Barry's face dropped as he heard these words. No, please not crucifixion. That was the worst way to die. He knew what this meant. You see, it wasn't just the crucifixion. It was the whole process of torture and pain leading up to it. So first, Roman soldiers would whip the prisoner, but not just any whip. They would get something that was called the cat of nine tails. It had 9 pieces of leather, each embedded with bits of bone, metal, fragments of glass, anything really. And your arms would be tied around a whipping post. You'd be stripped naked, and then you'd be hit repeatedly with that whip on your back. And just before you passed out from the pain, they would untie you, and then they would make you walk to your place of crucifixion. If you were really unlucky, they would make you carry your cross. Well, not the whole cross, because that usually weighed about 300 pounds or 136 kilograms. So usually they'd make you carry the crossbar, which weighed about 100 pounds or 45 kilograms. And the only way to carry it was on your back. So your arms would be tied to the wood like this, and it would be placed on your back. But remember, that back had just been whipped. And then you would reach your destination in agony. And they'd construct the cross, they would lie you on it, and they'd nail your hands and your feet to it. But it wasn't the nail that killed you. It wasn't the loss of blood that you would die from. After many hours, it was the suffocation that killed you, because your body would start to sag from the weight, which meant then you couldn't breathe as your lungs got squashed. And then you'd have to lift yourself up to take a breath, which caused agony. Barry wept at the thought of what was about to happen to him. He thought of his wife and children that would probably be out in that crowd. He thought of his dear elderly mother, who he would never hug again. And he sobbed as he reflected on his life, and he cried out to God to save him. And as he gathered himself together, he heard footsteps and keys jangling. He trembled with fear as he watched the cell door unlock and the jailer step inside, desperately trying to mentally prepare himself for what was about to happen next. "Tell me your name," the jailer said. "Barry," he replied. "No, your full Jewish name." "My name is Jesus Barabbas, and I know that today I will be crucified." The jailer looked up and paused. "No, young man, your name is Jesus Barabbas, and today you will walk a free man," he said as he removed the chains from his hands and his feet. Barry looked around in confusion, unsure whether to run for the door or stay and ask questions. But the jailer spoke before he could do either. "Jesus of Nazareth has taken your place. They call him the King of the Jews, and today he will die instead of you." With tears in his eyes, Barry ran through those doors as fast as he could, out into the daylight, out into the fresh air, but also into this huge crowd of people. He pushed his way through the bodies, men, women and children who had gathered this early morning. The smell of roast lamb and herbs still hung in the air, and Barry realised that last night had been the Passover festival. Finally, he reached the front of the crowd, where he saw a naked man being whipped. It was exactly as Jesus Barabbas had pictured it, exactly what he was expecting to happen to him. Except it wasn't him. It was this other Jesus. The soldiers took it in turns, whipping and laughing, mocking and jeering at Jesus, kicking him as well as whipping him. There was hardly any skin left on Jesus' back. Then they untied him and they wrapped a red robe around him. That wasn't usual. That was strange. One of them had made a sort of crown out of a rose bush, and he pushed it onto Jesus' head, the thorns digging into Jesus' scalp. But Jesus didn't cry out in pain. He didn't try to fight. In fact, he had a sort of peace about him, but a single tear rolled down his cheek. "Hail, King of the Jews!" the soldiers shouted, while spitting at him and hitting him on the head with a stick. "Hail, King of the Jews!" the crowd shouted back, laughing and mocking. "Why don't you save yourself, Messiah?" one guy near Barabbas shouted. And Barabbas watched in horror as Jesus was then dressed in his own clothes. The crossbar was tied to him, blood dripping down his back and at his feet, soaking his clothes. And he was pushed and he was poked until he walked away up the hill. Barabbas didn't have the strength to follow. After months in prison, he was dehydrated and starving. He sat at the side of the road, reeling from what had just happened to him. He just watched a man die for him, a man that he'd never seen or spoken to, just took his place, just took his punishment, took his pain, and he walked free. Barabbas fell to his knees in repentance. He said sorry for his anger, for his hatred, for his violence and his crime, and he cried out to God to have mercy on him and asked him for forgiveness. And so that's our story of Barry the Zealot, the story of a man who deserved to be punished but was set free. Now, I've used some poetic license in the telling of that story. There was a Jesus Barabbas that was set free that day, but we don't know much about him and his life. But on the whole, this isn't a story at all. This is the grace we live under every day. The image of Jesus being flogged to within an inch of his life, the mocking, the pain, the anguish, the cross. It was not just for Barabbas. It was for you. It was for me. It was so that each of us can know what freedom is. So in our groups, we're going to do 3 things now. First, please can you read the actual passage? I've shared with you a story based on Matthew 27, but don't rely on my interpretation. Let's open our Bibles and read it together. Secondly, I'd love you to share your thoughts. For some people, I think hearing this in a fresh way might have been quite profound. What did you notice as you listened? What struck you? What made you think? How did you feel? And thirdly, let's respond to this by breaking bread and sharing wine together. Because in this passage, we see Jesus' body actually get broken and his blood is shed. And only the night before, just 12 hours earlier, Jesus had sat with his disciples and he had told them that the bread they were eating was his body broken for them. And he had shared a cup of wine and he had told them it was his blood shed for them. He told them to remember him in this way, sitting with friends in community, passing around bread and wine and entering into the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. And let's remember that this part of the story is deeply sad and we can stay in that place. But thankfully, we know that hope is still to come and we know that this isn't the end for Jesus.